Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome Rick Atkinson and his book, The Fate of the Day, The War for America. And we'd like to thank viewers who make Book Breaks possible. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan, who will be taking your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, we are so thrilled today to have Rick Atkinson, a Pulitzer Prize winning historian and journalist. He is also the author of The Brits Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777, which won the George Washington Prize in 2020. Welcome, Rick. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Hi, Gina. I'm happy to be here.
Now, can you just give us a brief overview of this book and where it fits in your trilogy of works?
Yes, this is volume two in a projected trilogy, knock wood. And this book picks up where volume one, The British Are Coming, left off. And that's in the early spring of 1777. We have seen in volume one the war begin at Lexington and Concord, famously, on April 19th, 1775. And we've seen 2 years of very difficult war in which the Americans nearly lose the war on several occasions. Partly, it has to be said, because of mediocre generalship by General Washington, who's the commander in chief of the new Continental Army. And so, in that first volume, we have seen Washington manage to evict the British from Boston in March of 1776. But then in New York, he loses the Battle of Long Island, the biggest battle of the entire American Revolution in terms of participants. He's evicted from Manhattan. He's chased across New Jersey, across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And he's so depressed, really, that he writes to his brother in December of 76, I think the game is pretty near up. And out of desperation, and he is desperate, he famously, on the Christmas night, 1776, crosses eastbound across the Delaware into New Jersey and attacks the Hessian garrison in Trenton and destroys it. And then a week later, he does the same thing. He crosses the Delaware again. He baits the British into attacking him in Trenton, and he outflanks the British and attacks the British rear guard garrison in Princeton and destroys that. And then he goes to winter quarters in Morristown. It's in the highlands of North Jersey, and he's safe there. And so nothing much happens for several months. This book picks up then, not in New Jersey, but in Versailles, where we meet initially Queen Marie Antoinette. She's an Austrian who has married the King of France. She's a spendthrift and quite the character. She's known around the French court as Madame Deficit. And we meet her husband, Louis XVI, because the game for the Americans at this point, and this is early spring of 1777, is to persuade the Roman Catholic absolute monarchy in France that it's in France's best interest to come in full bore with the Americans, the Protestant, wannabe Republican Americans who are waging an insurrection against their lawful monarch. It's a heavy lift diplomatically. And the man who's responsible for making that happen is Benjamin Franklin. He's in his 70s at this point. He has been in France since December of 76. He's our first and greatest diplomat, and he is there to persuade Louis and the King's court that the Americans need not just the clandestine assistance that the French have been providing with shipments of gunpowder and other munitions, but we actually need full support with soldiers and a navy, because among other things, we're fighting the greatest navy the world has ever seen in the Royal Navy. So that's where the book begins. We also meet at this beginning a 19-year-old spindly redhead named Gilbert du Motier. You know him better as the Marquis de Lafayette. He is ablaze with enthusiasm for the American cause. And even though the king, Louis XVI, has ordered him not to leave France, he has, because he's one of the richest boys in France, purchased a ship. And with a small group of boon companions, he's about to sail from Bordeaux for America, where he will join General Washington, because he has a Major General's commission in the Continental Army, despite the fact that he has very little military experience. So this gets us off and running, and then the book is going to follow the next 3 years of the war, the middle years of the Revolution, and we're going to see battles at Bennington, at Germantown, at Brandywine, Saratoga, the 2 battles at Saratoga. There's a lot of fighting. And things look very grim for the Americans again, especially at Valley Forge in the winter of 77, 78, when more than 2,000 American soldiers die. They look grim when the British capture Savannah, and then particularly when they capture Charleston and destroy the 5,000-man American army that's in Charleston. That's in May of 1780. And that's where the book ends. So we're going to follow this arc, the vicissitudes of the army, the vicissitudes of Washington and his generals, and the misery that the war causes for virtually everyone involved, whether you're American, British, German, French, civilian, military. It's a grim thing, and this book tracks it in some detail.
Well, it's just amazing how much ground you cover. And you mentioned beginning the book in France. And I was wondering, you write that the American war against Britain inflamed the French imaginations. Why was that?
Yeah, part of it is, it's an absolute monarchy in France. If you're a French citizen, unless you're a member of the nobility, you're really oppressed generally. You have very few rights. You have nothing like the citizenship that we take for granted today in the US. The king is an absolute monarch. What he says is law. You have no voting rights to speak of as a French citizen. And so when the Americans pitch their vision of the future, which is in a kind of inchoate way, a republic in which all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. This really catches the French imagination. They're very aware of what's happening in America. They're very aware that the best way to stick it to the British, which is the preeminent French concern, is to support the Americans. The French and the British have fought 4 dynastic wars going back into the 17th century. 3 of them had ended inconclusively. The 4th one, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, as we call in America, was an overwhelming British victory against France and her sister Bourbon regime, the Spanish. And it has cost France, it has gained Britain, rather, Canada, 500,000 fertile acres west of the Appalachians, rich sugar islands in the West Indies where the real money is, parts of India. And France, beginning with a king and on down through the nobility and every Frenchman really, feels that France's role as the preeminent power on the continent of Europe has been lost. That the British have taken it away from them, and they are burning for revenge. And so in addition to feeling this native affection for what the Americans claim they're fighting for, France sees an opportunity through the Americans to reassert themselves among the community of nations in Europe and sticking it to the British. And so that's where we are.
Now, one of the things you do so beautifully in this book is make these larger than life figures feel so human. And you mentioned the Battle of Brandywine. Can you tell us what was notable about George Washington's leadership during that battle?
Yeah, what's notable is the lack of good generalship. Washington becomes the commanding general of the new Continental Army in early July of 1775. He's a Virginian, and he's been put in command of what the Second Continental Congress calls the Continental Army, even though it's mostly New Englanders, militiamen, who have mustered into this supposedly national army. And the thought is that by putting a Virginian in charge, you signal that it is a continental force. You use it as a recruiting tool, hoping that Southerners will join the cause and join the army. The ambition is that Washington, who's really the only guy around who's got significant military experience, and that experience is 5 years as a militia colonel for Virginia during the French and Indian War, always under superior British command. But it's 5 years of fairly intense combat. He's seen a lot, but he's been out of uniform for 16 years. And there's a lot that he doesn't know that he never knew. He doesn't know much about cavalry. He doesn't know a lot about artillery. He knows nothing about continental logistics because he's never had to concern himself with that. And so the 16 years out of uniform, notwithstanding, here he is in command of this brand new creation, the Continental Army. He's not a natural great captain. He doesn't see the battlefield spatially and temporally the way a Napoleon does, or even a Ulysses Grant. And so he makes a lot of mistakes. He makes them at the Battle of Long Island, for example, by not doing his own reconnaissance of the ground, the Gowanus Heights near close to where Brooklyn is now, close to where you are, Gina. And he gets outflanked. The British go around him, and he wakes up in the morning and the enemy's behind him. That's never good. And he barely survives that. He barely saves the army. They slip away in the fog at night across the East River, and he lives to fight another day, but he's lost Long Island. He's soon going to lose Manhattan Island. At Brandywine, which is a very small community southwest of Philadelphia, just inside the Pennsylvania border, he does the same thing by failing to go out and looking at the land himself. Now, this is a guy who used to make his living as a surveyor. You would think that the land would be particularly notable to him, that he would recognize the importance of terrain. At Brandywine, again, he gets outflanked. The British go around him. Once again, he's suddenly alerted to the fact that they are behind him. Once again, he's scrambling to save the army, and he once again barely pulls his troops together, and they manage to slip away again in the dark. Darkness saves him at Brandywine, along with some help from some of his lieutenants who fight valiantly. So Brandywine is a major defeat for them. He retreats back toward Philadelphia. He's going to be chased around eastern Pennsylvania for a while. He tries to recoup at Germantown. That battle is October 4th, 1777. Brandywine has been about a month earlier. And he concocts this overly elaborate attack scheme at Germantown, 4 different avenues of attack, 4 different columns descending on Germantown, which is where the British Army is bivouacked at dawn. It's too complicated, and it works until it doesn't. And the plan kind of falls apart at Germantown. The British are surprised at first. They're retreating. They recoup. And they counterattack, and Germantown goes from being a victory into a pretty significant defeat. So this is Washington's lot in 1777. Philadelphia is captured by the British. That's been the ambition of General William Howe, the British commanding general. And the British are going to spend a very comfortable winter in Philadelphia, a nice place to keep yourself warm. Whereas Washington and the army go to a place called Valley Forge, 20 miles west of Philadelphia, where it's utterly miserable. More than 2,000 American soldiers die that winter at Valley Forge from malnutrition and disease and general misery. So this is where we see Washington. The year 1777 is not the high point of his generalship.
Another larger-than-life figure who pops in and out of the book is Benjamin Franklin. Can you tell us about his public versus private actions in France during this time?
Yes. Franklin is by far and away the most famous American in the world as a consequence of his scientific discoveries about electricity and his inventions. He's been famous worldwide since the 1750s. He's retired now. He's no longer a printer, but he's a member of Congress, and he has been sent on this diplomatic mission to France that I talked about earlier. He is our first and greatest diplomat, and he arrives in France and finds that he is hugely popular. Everyone in France knows who he is. when he rides down the streets of Paris in his coach. Throngs of people race after him. It's like a rock star. Many French households have little busts of Franklin on their mantels. Franklin's wearing this kind of ratty marten skin cap that he got in Canada on a failed diplomatic mission. And pretty soon, all of the fine ladies in Paris are wearing little faux marten pelts on top of their huge bouffant hairdos. It's like that for Franklin. He really likes it. He loves adulation. He plays it for all it's worth. His French is fractured. It's not particularly good. And he compensates for that by being silent a lot of the time, which is mistaken for wisdom. And when he says nothing, people just assume that he's thinking deep thoughts. His diplomatic skills prove to be very formidable. He is very patient. He works his popularity as a lever against the French court in Versailles. He knows that the American cause is popular, and he uses that popularity to influence and pressure the king, Count Vergennes, who's the French foreign minister, and others in the French government. His patience is going to pay off ultimately when the Americans win two signal victories at Saratoga in September and October 1777. The first battle is largely a draw. This is against an army of British and German troops. 8,000 of them have come down out of Canada, and they are trying to get themselves into the Hudson Valley, which they do successfully, but then they're stopped at Saratoga, and the two battles end in the destruction of that Anglo-German army. All 8,000 of those men are killed or captured, and it's the turning point of the war, particularly for Franklin, who can then go to Versailles and say, look what we did. And it's very impressive, and it persuades Louis, the king, that in fact the Americans have the wherewithal to pull this off, that they can slug it out with the British. And again, if the French want to stick it to the British, the best way to do this is to embrace the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the friends at this point will be the Americans. And so Franklin persuades the French in the early spring of 1778 to sign two treaties with the Americans, and they are going to enter the war on our behalf. And it's a war-winning turn of events. We don't win our independence in 1783 without the French. And they're going to be followed a year later by the Spanish. They will come in against the British, and eventually by the Dutch. Britain has no friends. The only ally they have in the world is tiny Portugal. And it's a reminder of the importance of the best team, which usually wins in war. And as it turns out, we have the best team in the American Revolution.
Now, going back to the colonies, you wrote too about the Civil War that was happening within the Civil War. Can you tell us about that with sort of the native peoples?
Yeah, the Civil War plays out on a couple of levels. First, there are 2.5 million Americans in the colonies when the war begins in 1775. 500,000 of them are enslaved blacks. Of the 2 million white Americans, about 20%, as we know from modern scholarship, are loyalists. They remain loyal to George III, our last king, loyal to the crown. And so the war, right from the beginning, is going to be a civil war between rebels, patriots, and loyalists. And it's going to get nastier and nastier. And it is our first civil war. It brings everything that every civil war does. And as the war goes on, the last couple of years of the war are almost entirely in the South. There are lots of atrocities committed by both sides. It is very, very awful. So that's one civil war. It also plays out among Native American tribes. The Six Nation of the Iroquois have gotten along very well with each other for centuries. But when the American Revolution begins, those 6 tribes have to choose sides. 4 of them are going to align with the British, 2 of them are going to align with the Americans, and they're going to end up fighting each other. So there's a civil war among Indian tribes. It's bad for all Indians everywhere. The war leads to a lot of misery, and the long-term consequences for the Indians, regardless of whom they're aligned with, is really awful. The complexities of the war are manifold, and we find ourselves in trying to understand it, not just seeing us versus them, meaning us, the Americans, versus them, the British, but it becomes a global war. It's fought on 4 continents in the 7 seas. It becomes a civil war, and it becomes a civil war within a civil war. So this is one of the reasons it lasts for 8 years, and it's one of the reasons why it's so complicated.
Yeah. One figure who really jumped out at me was Nathaniel Greene, who you wrote was second only to Washington as the Continental Army's indispensable man. Why was that?
Well, he's a fascinating character, and I'm afraid that many Americans today don't know who he was, which is a shame because he is second only to Washington. He's a lapsed Quaker from Rhode Island. He's been an anchor smith. His family runs foundries that make anchors and other heavy duty metal works. When he shows up in Cambridge in the summer of 1775, as Washington arrives to take command of the army, Washington has a very good eye for subordinate talent. So he has seen in Cambridge, for example, this 25-year-old Boston bookseller who's overweight and doesn't seem to have a lot of skills other than selling books. And somehow Washington intuits that this guy's going to be the father of American artillery. His name is Henry Knox, and he is the father of American artillery. He sees Greene, and Greene at this point is a brigadier general of the Rhode Island contingent that's in Cambridge. And he sees in Greene some of the same traits that Washington himself has: a big brain organized for executive action, willing to take responsibility, willing to make decisions, extremely well organized, and very capable of leading men in combat. And so he relies on Greene more and more for advice, for duties on and off the battlefield. And at Valley Forge, in that awful winter, in the late winter of 1777, 78, when the army is coming apart at the seams, the supply system has collapsed, men are in danger of starving to death, their horses are starving to death, Washington turns to Greene and says, I need you to be my quartermaster general. You need to run my supply system for me. And Greene says, I don't want to. Nobody in history has ever heard of a quartermaster general. It's true, quote unquote. And Washington says, you got it. I need you to do this. And so Greene, out of loyalty to Washington, loyalty to the army, loyalty to the cause, takes it on. And he's brilliant at it. He uses all of those skills and capabilities that he's got with that big brain organized for executive action. And for 2 years, he's the quartermaster general, and he helps save the army, really. And then at the end of those 2 years, and we're going to see this in volume 3, he's put back in the field, and he is the primary commander as the war moves to the south. The last big battle in the north during the Revolution is at Monmouth in northern New Jersey, better known as Freehold and better known as the hometown of Bruce Springsteen. But that's that battle in late June of 1778 is the last big battle in the north. The war moves south, and Greene moves south with it, and he's extraordinarily capable in that battlefield role, and is one of the primary reasons why ultimately there's going to be victory at Yorktown in October 1781. He's not at Yorktown, but he has been leading the British all over the South and playing hob with their ambitions there. So the the last thing I'll say about him, he's a tragic figure in that after the war, when he should be one of the founders and he should be participating in the Constitutional Convention, and Henry Knox, that overweight Boston bookseller, becomes the first Secretary of War in Washington's first presidential administration. Greene is not participating because he's dead. He has ended the war broke, as many of them do. As compensation for his service to the cause, he's given confiscated plantations in Georgia that have been taken from loyalists. This is a guy from Rhode Island. He moves to Georgia with his gorgeous, lively wife, Cotty, and becomes a gentleman planter. And one day in, I think it's 1788, he's out in the fields. It's very hot. He's not wearing a hat. There's no such thing as sunblock. And he suffers from sunstroke and he dies. He's buried in Savannah, of all places. He never goes back to Rhode Island. And so he's not around when the next big events that lead to the founding of the Republic take place. Whenever people are in Savannah, they should go pay their respects to Greene's tomb, which is right in the center of Savannah. And we ought to remember him because he is a memorable, important figure.
Absolutely. Well, our chat is starting to blow up. So before I pass you back to Ryan, I was just wondering what you hope readers take away upon finishing this book.
I hope they take away a lot, Gina. I think, among other things, we should remember, and the semi-quincentennial, which sounds like a medical procedure, but is actually the 250th anniversary of the founding of this country, and it's beginning now, should remind us that we're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that founding generation. And it includes personal liberties. It includes strictures on how to divide power and keep it from concentrating in the hands of authoritarians who think primarily themselves. We cannot allow that priceless heritage to slip away or to be taken away. And we cannot be oblivious to this extraordinary gift from them, or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it over the past 250 years. So I hope that the semi-quincentennial, and this book being a very small part of it, will remind people of what they gave us, as well as, reminding people that it is one of the greatest stories in the history of our species. You could not make it up. It's beyond the imagination of even a Tolstoy. And it's our foundation story, so we should embrace it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, on that note, I'm going to pass you over to Ryan, who's going to get us started with our student scholar question of the week.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gina. So many questions to get to. I'll get to as many as possible. Excellent questions. I'm just looking in our chat. But as Gina mentioned, we always begin this part of the program with our history student scholar question of the week. For folks who are new, this is a weekly competition in which students from all over the country and actually the world have an opportunity to submit a question. The winning question will be read aloud, and that student and their teacher will also receive a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History gift shop. And the questions are always excellent, and I think this week is no exception. Our winner is in Mrs. Madden's class. The student's name is MST. Or Mist. I'm sorry. I hope I'm saying that name correctly, but it's an excellent question for you, Rick, and it goes like this. In the Fate of the Day, you show how the Revolutionary War in the Middle Years was filled with ups and downs. What do you think the actions and decisions of the American, British, and Loyalist forces during this time tell us about how hard it is to hold on to revolutionary ideals over the long course of a long and difficult war?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's a complicated question. I'll try not to belabor my answer. I mean, one of the things that we know from our own more contemporary wars is that when you're waging an insurrection, when you're trying to overthrow the ruling powers somehow, and we know this from Vietnam, we know this from Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other places, those insurrectionists need to only not lose. If you're fighting a counterinsurrection, you're trying to quash the insurrection, you're trying to assert power of the existing power. And again, we know this from our own experience fighting counterinsurrections in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. You've got to win, especially if it is a expeditionary war where you have to send your army a long way away, which has its own complications. And that's where the British are for 8 years. They've got to win. Washington has to not lose. And that's something that Washington learns in the first couple of years of the war, that he cannot slug it out toe-to-toe with the British over and over. They have this large professional army with a fair amount of experience. They have the greatest navy the world has ever seen. And we can't match that. And so he realizes that he's got to fight on what we call the strategic defensive. He's looking for opportunities to nick and bleed the enemy. He's looking for opportunities to fight battles on terms that are entirely favorable to him, but he's not going to slug it out in hopes of one titanic battle that decides the war, because he's probably going to lose that one. And it takes him some time to recognize that. He's very aggressive. He doesn't like having to play defense, but that's where he is. And so that's one of the reasons that the war is going to take the route that it does. That's one of the reasons why so much of the war seems inconclusive. You know, the Americans will win one or partly win one, the British will win one or partly win one, and it's never really decisive until Saratoga is pretty decisive because that army is destroyed, and ultimately Yorktown is going to be very decisive because that British army is also destroyed. So, you know, these are some of the issues that are at play here. The dynamic of the war changes over time. The British embrace several strategic misconceptions that are going to prolong the war. They believe, for example, there are many more loyalists. There's kind of a silent majority of loyalists who just need to be tapped in order to have them participate with the British Army in quashing the rebellion. Well, that's wrong. They're wrong about that. And they make they embrace other strategic misconceptions that ultimately are going to cost them the war.
Fascinating. Thanks so much for that great question, and of course the great answer. As I said, I'll try to get to as many of these great questions as I can, and as time allows. Matthew says, recognizing their chronic funding problems, how actually did the Continental Army consistently make payroll?
Yeah, they didn't, is the short answer. You know, the Americans had a big problem with their currency. And it got worse as the war went on, to the point that the dollar, the American currency, the continental dollar, known as the continental, was worthless. Not worth a continental was a phrase that you heard a lot in the latter years of the war. We relied on several things. First, Congress just kept printing money, and they would print ultimately hundreds of millions of dollars. That's inflationary. It causes the currency to devalue so that it ultimately is worth literally nothing. You're paying your soldiers and you're giving them pay raises in a failed and futile attempt to try to keep up with inflation. There are lots of complaints about it. Barter becomes as important as just the normal transaction with currency. We beg the French for money, and the French end up giving us tens of millions of livres. That's their currency, and that's very important. They also give us a lot of supplies and things that we don't have to buy. We ask other countries for financial support, and we get some from the Spanish, for example, some from the Dutch. But it's hand to mouth, and it's a persistent nightmare of a problem for Congress, which never has any good solutions to this, and for the Army. The soldiers will go months without getting paid at all, and when they do get paid, the currency is not worth a continental, literally. There are we're going to see mutinies in the ranks, and the cause for those mutinies in part is because of men being disgruntled and not being paid. A lot of them have joined the army, and the complexion of the army has changed a lot from the early months in 1775. A lot of them have joined the army for the $6 and change that a private earns. Well, pretty soon that $6 is not worth $6. It's not worth 6 cents. And so the disgruntlement it's a challenge for Washington and his officers to keep men committed to the cause when in fact they're fighting for free. They're not fighting because they're making any money, because they're not making any money.
Fascinating. Great question by Matthew, and great answer. Paul says, how would you rate, or asks rather, how do you rate the leadership and effectiveness of someone who should sound familiar to many of us, Benedict Arnold, in the war efforts specifically in northern New York?
Yeah, Benedict Arnold is the best tactical leader on either side in the first couple of years of the war. He is a man born to lead other men in the dark of night. And Washington recognizes this early on. Arnold is from Connecticut. His family had been fairly well off until his father, who was an alcoholic, kind of drank away the family fortune. Arnold was supposed to go to Yale, but they had no money. Instead, he was apprenticed as an apothecary. And he makes a go of it. This is in the 1760s, where he's a successful merchant, and he even gets to the point he calls himself Dr. Arnold. He hangs out his shingle. He's not a doctor. Hangs out his shingle and expands his little merchant empire to the point where he owns several ships, and he sends them off on trading missions to the West Indies and Canada. When the war begins, he has participated in Connecticut militia and has one of the first achievements of the war. He and a rascal from Vermont named Ethan Allen, whose men are called the Green Mountain Boys, together, even though they're bickering the whole time they're together, Arnold and Allen, capture Fort Ticonderoga, the so-called Gibraltar of the North. There's a small British garrison there. It's at the southern end of Lake Champlain. It's a really important post for protecting the Hudson River Valley from invasion from the north, for example, out of Canada. And Arnold and Allen with their men overrun the garrison, and they take Ticonderoga. This impresses Washington. And when Arnold shows up in Cambridge later that summer of 1775 and meets Washington for the first time, Washington, who is planning an invasion of Canada, because we've not been able to persuade the Canadians become the 14th colony peaceably, so we're going to force them to do it. Allen is given command of one of the two wings that are going into Canada, one from the west commanded by General Richard Montgomery, and the one in the east commanded by Colonel Benedict Arnold. Arnold leads his men through the Maine wilderness in the late fall of 1775. It's one of the greatest, most dramatic feats of arms in American military history. And they end up at the gates of Quebec, Fortress Quebec, on the St. Lawrence River. They were unified with General Montgomery's troops coming down from Montreal, which they've captured. And it looks at this point as though all of Canada is going to fall to the Americans. They attack Quebec the last night of 1775, and it's a failure. It's a defeat. Arnold is badly wounded. Montgomery's killed. The British hold on to Fortress Quebec, and they're going to chase the Americans out of Canada. Arnold is important in saving that army, leading them out of Canada down Lake Champlain. He helps to delay the Royal Navy chasing them across the lake. So we see this sequence of successes that he's had. He's been badly wounded at Quebec, shot in the leg. Again, Washington says, well, that is one fighting general, because he's now a general. I really need him. He's going to, at the battles of Saratoga in the fall of 1777, Arnold is going to be as important as any American officer there. He leads from the front. He's going to contribute to the draw that the first battle is. Neither side really wins it. But the second battle is a clear American victory, and Arnold is largely responsible for that. Again, he's wounded. He's shot in the same left leg. It's a very serious wound. He's going to be months recuperating. He never completely recuperates. His left leg is going to be 2 inches shorter than it had been before he was wounded. And he's got grievances. And these grievances include feeling underappreciated by Congress, which is true. He is underappreciated by Congress. Lesser men are promoted ahead of him. He's got financial problems. And so what we're going to see is these grievances begin to fester with Arnold. He begins a treasonous correspondence with the British, and famously is ultimately going to be, his name is going to be synonymous with treason in American military history.
Wow. Fascinating story, and great question and answer. Chris says, I just loved your book. How would you characterize the power and influence of King George versus Parliament and the government in prosecuting the war? As a history teacher, I think the perception is he was a figurehead, but in your book, he seems to be much more of an active character.
Yeah, he's definitely not a figurehead. I mean, we tend to caricature him in our view of him. He is not the tyrant that Jefferson calls him in the Declaration of Independence. He's not the royal brute that the polemicist Thomas Paine calls him in Common Sense, which was published in January 1776. He's not the sinister ninny who prances across the stage every night in Hamilton singing "You'll Be Back." He's a constitutional monarch. He's a child of the Enlightenment. He's a great supporter of both the arts and the sciences. He's, in some ways, the most reluctant to allow, among the British leadership, to allow the Americans their independence. And to some extent, he is driving the train when it comes to British policy. He is definitely not a figurehead. Now, under 18th century British law, he is restricted as a constitutional monarch. He must pay attention to Parliament, both the houses of House of Commons and the House of Lords. He has a cabinet that he's must listen to. And it certainly has to listen to public opinion. He's not an absolute monarch like, for example, Louis XVI is in France. Nevertheless, he embraces those strategic misconceptions that I talked about. And one of the things that George believes from the beginning to the end of the war is that if the Americans are permitted to slip away, if they are granted their independence, if they dissociate themselves from the British Empire, that it will be the beginning of the British Empire, because it will encourage insurrections in Ireland, in Canada, in the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, in India. And the new British Empire, which has only been created at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, will come unstitched. And Britain will sink into relative position of inferiority, as the king calls it, within the nations of Europe. And he's not going to let that happen. It's just not going to happen on his watch. And so he is adamant and resolute in resisting political accommodation right from the beginning. Before the first shots at Lexington and Concord, George says blows must decide. And he never deviates that until battlefield circumstances, British losses at places like Yorktown require him to capitulate. So I find him to be a fascinating character. He's very much, he's very robust. There was a play some years ago called The Madness of King George, and then it became a movie. During the American Revolution, he's got all his marbles. He's completely possessed of his faculties. Later in life, he's going to show erratic mental episodes that are ultimately going to ruin his life. We now know that basically he's a manic depressive, and it manifests itself with him. This is beginning in earnest in 1788, 5 years after the war ends, with periods in which he's incoherent, he's hallucinating, he's violent, he has to be restrained. They put a straitjacket on him for periods of time. It goes away, but then it comes back again in the 1790s, in 1804. And he's getting to be an old man at this point. In 1810, and he's become king in 1760. So at this point, he's been king for 50 years. In 1810, he has another episode that never ends. And for the last 10 years of his life, he's quite crazy. It's a very sad, pathetic last decade of his life. So, that's George. And again, I think that trying to understand the nuances of his personality and of his reign are important to understand why the revolution plays out the way it does.
Absolutely. Great question and answer. So many in our audience are wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how this trilogy compares to other books and periods and trilogies that you have written in the past. Was it more difficult, less difficult, any similarities or differences?
Yeah, this is my 8th book. All have been about American wars, 5 American wars over the course of 8 books. I spent 15 years writing about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. Those books followed the 3 campaigns in that liberation. North Africa, where the American role in Europe really begins, and Sicily and Italy, and then finally Western Europe beginning at Normandy. It took me almost 15 years to do that trilogy. This trilogy, I'm 2/3 of the way through it probably will take me about the same amount of time, is similar in that, the heart of the story is the American soldier and leadership, and good and bad, and an existential struggle. The revolution is existential. The very existence of the country that wants to become a country, the United States, is at stake. And in World War II, it's existential in that our battle against fascism in Germany and in Japan, Italy, is going to determine what kind of world we're going to live in. So they're similar in that respect. They're very different in other respects. By the time we enter the war in World War II, we are the world power. We're not just a world power. And we're going to show that in World War II. It's going to be affirmed in World War II. We're not any kind of power when the American Revolution begins. The country is so much different. By the time we get to World War II, 130 million people versus 2.5 million. The military is quite different, even though it's relatively small when World War II begins. The American Army and the other services they're going to be 16.1 million people in uniform. Washington can't even begin to imagine a force that size with that kind of firepower available and so on. But ultimately, I find, and I've been around our contemporary military a lot in places like Somalia and Iraq and Afghanistan, Bosnia. On some level, an infantryman is an infantryman is an infantryman, and what they go through, why they fight, what they endure, would be entirely familiar to Thucydides, writing about the Greeks 2,500 years ago, or Civil War soldiers. They're kind of a piece when it comes to soldiering life, the affection that blooms on battlefields among comrades, the loneliness and privation and terror and boredom and all of those things that are so common on battlefields are similar between World War II and the American Revolution.
Wow, fascinating. And I did see in the, we don't have time for the question, I don't think, but I did see a reference to Thucydides and his trap. So funny that you should mention that. I need to brush up on my antiquity. But if we have time, maybe for two more questions, I'll try to get to them. One interesting question is just about the role of insurgents. Francis Marion is perhaps the most famous insurgent, sort of this guerrilla warfare, but aspect. Is that sort of overrated in our mind, or did that type of warfare really impact the outcome?
No, it was quite vital, particularly as the war moves to the south. Francis Marion is a South Carolinian, and there are several like him. Those of us who are old enough remember there was a TV show called Swamp Fox, and it was about Francis Marion. I can still hear the jingle in my head, and it glorified and romanticized Marion and others fighting the British. It was important because, again, you're probably not capable of slugging it out toe to toe, line to line against British regulars. But if you can attack them when they're not expecting attacks, when you can disrupt their supply lines, when you can ambush them, when you can make life miserable for them and you can bleed them slowly, that can be very effective. That's what insurgents do. And that's what the likes of Francis Marion and others in the South do. And there are similar insurgencies waged throughout all of the colonies, really. And sometimes it's militia. It's not the Continental Army itself. These are part-time soldiers who rally with their companies or their regiments when they're needed. And they perform various services beyond just shooting at the British, including gathering fodder for livestock, preventing the British from getting fodder, preventing the British from gathering supplies. They act as a political commissars, really, to use a Soviet term. They're like the Taliban. If you're a loyalist and you've been friendly to the British when they've been in your neighborhood and you show loyalty to the crown, you're likely to have these guys, the militia insurgents, come around your door and say, you're either going to sign an oath renouncing any allegiance to the crown right now, or we're going to take your farm. We're going to burn your barn. We're going to put you in jail. We're going to beat you. This happens a lot. It happens by both sides. And so that's one of the fundamental roles that the militia insurgents play throughout the war.
Wow, fascinating. And perhaps this is a nice accumulating question before I throw things back to Gina for some final thoughts. But we have so many teachers on the call today, close to 300 people on the call, many of whom are teachers. And Lois, I see, is one of our great teachers in our network, and others. And they're just wondering what's important about military history and founding era for our students today. Why is that important? You know, how can they teachers teach those two kind of topics better? How important is military history and the founding era to students today? You know, if you have any words for our teachers on the call, I'm sure they would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, well, first let me thank those teachers who are out there, whether you're on the call or not. You're doing the heavy lifting. It's so absolutely critical what you're doing, and I'm personally grateful for it. I know how important good teachers were to me, and so thank you for that. I think that teaching American history as a story is the way to win over hearts and minds of students. Characters really are larger than life, and they really do wrestle with their own defects. They all have feet of clay, including the George Washingtons of the world. None of them are made out of marble. And that makes them more interesting to me. I've been very involved for the last 3 years in Ken Burns' next big project, which is a 12-hour, 6-part documentary on the American Revolution that will air on PBS in November. And I think that'll be a very useful teaching tool. Burns in all of his films has always been very aware of potential classroom uses. And he also recognizes that the the character-driven nature of our national history, of all history, really, is one of the things that makes it riveting, or should make it riveting. That, you know, dates are important, and all the other architecture of history is important. But at the heart, it's about characters, and it's about character, and how it plays out, and how individual citizens can embrace it, or deal with it, come to grips with it. So I think that, you know, if I can remember when I was an 8th grader at George S. Patton Junior High School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. My father was an Army officer, encountering Benedict Arnold for the first time, and just being mesmerized by the conundrum of this man, his great competences, his incredible courage, his extraordinary achievements as a senior American general, and then, of course, you know, his despicable turning of coat. He's just one of dozens of characters that populate this period of our history, and make it one of the most interesting periods, not only of our history, but of human history. And so I think trying to use the struggles and vicissitudes and achievements and failures of characters is one of the ways to best illustrate history.
Well, perfectly said. Perfect place to throw things back to Gina. So many questions I didn't get around to. So sorry for that. Great remedy, as I always say, is get your hands on this book. All your answers can be found in this book, and there's links to get your hands on the book in the chat. Gina, back to you for some final thoughts.
Yes, and as Ryan mentioned, it's a fantastic read and a great book to use in your classroom, to use excerpts from. And we hope you will join us next week when our friend Ron Chernow joins us for his new book on Mark Twain. And you can go online to watch over 250 different scholar presentations of book breaks at gilderlehrman.org/booksbreaks, as well as historical documents, History Now, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Rick, it was such a pleasure to talk to you today, and we can't wait to have you back for the 3rd book.
Well, thank you, Gina. Thanks for the good conversation. I appreciate it, Ryan. And I'm grateful to Gilder Lehrman for the opportunity to have that conversation today.
Absolutely. Well, have a great day, everyone.
Bye.